G'day, I'm Martyn Iles, and it's an honour for me to address the annual March for the Babies from here in North Queensland. And the circumstances of the event this year mean that that is possible. I want to speak today about the pro-life movement, what it is, and why it's worth doing. Many of you will be aware of the very famous quote by Congressman Henry Hyde from the US. He said, "When the time comes, as it surely will, when we face that awesome moment, the final judgment, I've often thought, as Fulton Sheen wrote, that it is a terrible moment of loneliness. You have no advocates, but you are there alone, standing before God, and a terror will rip through your soul like nothing you can imagine. But I really think that those in the pro-life movement will not be alone. I think that there'll be a chorus of voices that have never been heard in this world, but are heard beautifully and clearly in the next world. And they will plead for everyone who has been in this movement. They will say to God, spare him, because he loved us." You know, by participating in the pro-life movement, you participate in an act of love for women, for children, for families, and indeed society. To love is to act. It is to act at cost to oneself. It is to act at cost to oneself to serve others. And the pro-life movement is about, firstly, action. We speak, we rally, we're politically activated, we respond to opportunities to do things, we pray, we vote, we appeal to our neighbours, we volunteer for charities that help women and children and families, and we practice what we preach in all of life. And we do all of those things at cost. As the definition of love goes, it is action at cost. The Good Samaritan was Christ's example of loving our neighbour. He was a man who cared to notice the problem. He took the time to attend to it, he took a risk, he gave of his own resources, including his money, and costly involvement in the pro-life movement includes all of those things. It starts with noticing the problem and caring enough to do something, even if it means it costs a reputation, even if it means our lives are not as quiet and comfortable as they could have been, or if it means our time, our energies, even if it means our wealth. But of course, involvement in the pro-life movement involves those things, but it involves them with the ultimate purpose and objective of serving others. And that's what an act of love is. It is an action at cost to oneself to serve others. In this modern world, we're told that the best thing we can do is serve ourselves. And that is what is at the core of the pro-abortion movement. It is that one word that we all know, autonomy. Choice. This, we're told, this is what's best. That a woman, or indeed her partner, as is often the case, as we know too often, should have the autonomy to choose to end a life. They make that claim because, of course, they have nowhere else to go. Autonomy is the last thing that they can rely on. Once upon a time, they may have argued science, but we know that now that a child, an unborn child, is a unique living human being. There's no doubt that it's human, for human beings couldn't produce any other kind of offspring. We know that it has its own unique DNA. We know that it has its own blood type, distinct from its mother. We know that its heart beats at 4 weeks. Abortion stops a beating heart. We know that these smallest and most vulnerable human beings with beating hearts stretch and make facial expressions by the dawn of the second trimester, feel pain at 16 weeks, are viable at 22 weeks. They can't argue science anymore. Once they might have argued medicine, healthcare. But since we know scientifically that this is a human life, we know medically that it must be protected and nurtured. The Hippocratic Oath says, first, do no harm. Killing is not, ought not ever, to be healthcare. Renowned surgeon Dr. Ben Carson has said this. He said, "I've had the privilege of being able to operate on little babies that were 25, 26, 27, 28 weeks gestation, and I can guarantee you that they can feel, they can react. You have to give them anesthesia if you're going to cut them, believe me. But they can also respond to comfort and to warmth. And for somebody to say that's a meaningless bunch of cells, honestly, that's just totally ignorant." Alternatively, might once have argued compassion. But they have no compassion for these lives, and their so-called compassion for women is false. It must be false, for it's based on a lie. We will hear shortly the post-abortion testimony, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but here are a couple of snippets from other women's stories which I've picked up. Laurie wrote this. She said, "I'll wake in the middle of the night thinking I hear a baby crying. I simply miss my baby. I constantly wake up wanting to nurse my child, wanting to hold my child, and that's something the doctor never told me I would experience. Or hear Ashley, every night my sweet boy prays to God for a sibling, and every time I hear those precious prayers, my heart aches over what I did. Or Millie, if he'd mentioned abortion, she says, it wouldn't have registered. I was profoundly disconnected from myself, but I began to feel weighted down by something. It wouldn't go away. Finally, a dream of huge significance, graphically involving a doctor, a jumbo bin, a dead body of a young teenage man, convinced me that I needed to do some work on my abortion. Make no mistake, compassion is not on their side, and so they fall back to so-called autonomy. But we're not serving ourselves today. We strive to serve others, and we do so by exposing this fact, whatever you call it, whatever justification you give it. Abortion is the killing of a human life, and it's killing our culture. It's doing unthinkable harm to women and to our society. It is unscientific. It is not healthcare. It is deeply inhumane to everyone involved. And helping people understand that truth will continue to take enormous amounts of effort and activity. It will continue to be costly to those who take it upon themselves, and it will continue to serve the highest and best interests of all. It will continue to be an act of love. And of course, that is precisely what we say. Love them both. When you participate in the pro-life movement, you participate in an act of love. You stand against evil. And every stand against evil is a stand against darkness, pain, and destruction. You stand for truth. And every stand for truth is a stand for life, for light, for happiness, and for freedom. And here's the thing, and this is the point I really want to make. It is worth it. Never lose heart. It's worth it on 3 levels. Firstly, it's worth it on a personal level. The very existence of a pro-life voice in any community means that individual women and men will encounter the truth. A rally, a YouTube video, a result in a Google search, a reading of a newspaper article, the encountering of a website, the availability of support services. These things reach hearts and minds, and they save lives, and they change hearts. And you know, in my experience in political lobbying, I find it easy to lose sight of this kind of change, because the change which comes through, this is the change which comes through the personal touch. And I call it the quiet change, the stuff that happens at the grassroots, in the community, because so often we never even know that it's happening. So often we couldn't even recite the names. We wouldn't know who in this life would encounter these sorts of messages. But believe me, it happens. And it happens far more often than we realise. Your voice and your action may touch a life. That's a personal act of love, and it's worth it. But it's also worth it at a political and a cultural level. You may think that politics is largely a closed book when it comes to the pro-life movement, and yet if this movement didn't exist, we'd be far worse off. Let me give you just 2 examples, one pro-life and one from my own recent work. In September 2019, Sydney held 2 enormous pro-life rallies in Martin Place and Hyde Park. The abortion law ultimately passed, but the chorus of voices, the activism we saw in those days, politicians saw that, and they had no idea it was even there before those days. It was a fact that those efforts directly impacted on political discussions in the weeks and months that followed, and contributed to moving law reforms like euthanasia off the table. Earlier that year in June, my friend Israel Folau was sacked from Rugby Australia for posting a Bible verse on Instagram. Again, people spoke by raising $2.2 million in 48 hours to protest his treatment. That event directly impacted corporate culture and professional sports in this country in a seismic way. And we even got to preach the gospel in the process. We may think that this is difficult politically, but God uses every faithful public word and deed. None of it is wasted. It's worth it. But you know, even if none of these things happened, it's worth it eternally. I used to think that that quote by Henry Hyde was largely poetic, but now I see that it has a great deal of truth in it. Jesus spoke in Luke's Gospel about using our earthly resources and possessions and wealth to, and I quote, make friends who will receive you into eternal dwellings. And I think that that's what we do in the pro-life movement. Their voices were not heard in this life. This world was not worthy of them. but there is a place where they will be heard, and they are all our friends. And I look forward to meeting their redeemed souls in paradise. And so let me finish with this. What you do changes things. It changes people. It changes culture. And it changes eternity.